You know, it's funny. Sometimes to really truly see a place, you need an outsider's eyes. Someone who isn't used to all the little everyday things can spot what's truly remarkable in a way that people who live there just can't. And that is exactly what travelers have done for centuries. When they showed up in a new place, they weren't just sightseers, they were witnesses to a completely different way of living, and they felt this urge to write down everything that struck them as strange, as wonderful, as different. I mean, think about it. For someone who'd never seen one, a coconut or a simple pond leaf wasn't just a plant, it was a marvel. And that's precisely why these accounts are so precious. They capture this pure sense of wonder that a local history might totally gloss over. So today, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to peer into the past, looking at the Indian subcontinent through three completely different sets of eyes from three different centuries. And we'll see how their stories didn't just describe the world, they helped shape it. Okay, first up, al-Biruni. He shows up in the 11th century, coming all the way from what's now Uzbekistan. And he wasn't your typical thrill-seeking adventurer. Nope, he was a scholar, a man on a very serious mission to understand a foreign civilization from the inside out. And what he produced was this absolute masterpiece called the Kitab al-Hind, literally the Book of India. And this thing was no travel diary. It was a massive, systematic encyclopedia trying to document an entire culture. And he did the hard work too. He spent years with local Brahminist scholars, learning Sanskrit so he could read their own sacred texts. And the way he structured it was just brilliant, so methodical. For each of his 80 chapters, he followed the same three-step pattern. He'd start with a question, then he'd explain the answer based on what the Indian text said, and finally, he'd compare it to other cultures he knew, like the ancient Greeks. It was almost like a scientific formula for understanding culture. But here's the thing, al-Biruni was really self-aware. He knew this was a huge challenge. He actually listed what he saw as the three biggest barriers to understanding. First, the sheer difficulty of the Sanskrit language. Second, the massive differences in religion and social customs. And third, what he saw as a kind of self-absorption among the locals. This is what makes him so fascinating. He would carefully explain things like the caste system right out of the Brahmanical books. But he wasn't just a copy-paste machine. He also added his own 2 cents, arguing that the whole idea of some people being polluted or impure just went against the laws of nature. He was a scholar who really thought for himself. All right, let's jump forward about 300 years. In the 14th century, a very different kind of guy arrives. Ibn Battuta, a Moroccan globetrotter who wasn't driven by academic curiosity, but by pure, unfiltered wanderlust. You gotta love that quote, right? It just says it all. For Ibn Battuta, the real knowledge wasn't buried in some old book. No, it was out there, on the road, found through experience. He truly believed that travel itself was the ultimate teacher. And boy, did he get an education. His journey was a roller coaster of highs and lows. I mean, the guy was attacked by bandits multiple times, badly wounded, even left for dead once. But then he'd also find himself in these huge, bustling cities full of opportunities and be totally blown away by things like the super efficient postal system. And his writing gives us this amazing window into his mind. How do you describe a coconut to people who've never even imagined such a thing? Well, you compare it to something they do know. A human head. It's such a simple, clever way to make the exotic feel familiar. And that postal system he was so impressed by? Get this, a normal trip from Sind to Delhi would take about 50 days, but a message from the Sultan's spies could make that same journey in just 5 days. That's the speed of information we're talking about, back in the 1300s. Just incredible. Okay, for our third and final traveler, we leap forward again, this time to the 17th century, to Mughal India. This is François Bernier, a French doctor. And he wasn't there just to learn or to have an adventure. He came with a very specific point of view and an agenda. See, unlike our other two guys, Bernier wasn't just writing for the general public. His work was dedicated to the King of France. And his whole approach was to constantly compare India to Europe, usually to point out how much better Europe was, as a kind of warning for the folks back home. Bernier had this one big central argument. He claimed the root of all of India's problems was that there was no private property, that the Mughal emperor owned all the land. And because of that, he argued, nobody had any reason to improve their land, which led to ruined farms, miserable peasants, and a society in decay. And that led him to this really bleak and frankly pretty shocking conclusion. He painted a picture of a country with no middle class at all, just a handful of rich rulers and a massive population of what he called beggars and barbarians. Now, that is the big question, isn't it? Bernier's writings became wildly popular back in Europe. They were super influential. But was the very foundation of his entire argument actually true? Well, here's the twist. Historians went back and looked at the actual Mughal records, and it turns out those documents tell a totally different story. They show the state collected a tax on the crops, yeah, but it was seen as a payment for protection, not as rent for land the king owned. And that one detail basically pulls the entire rug out from under Bernier's whole theory. And this is exactly why these old travel accounts matter so much. They weren't just stories, they had real-world impacts that echoed for centuries, shaping how entire continents thought about each other. The ripple effect from Bernier's writing is just staggering. His flawed idea about land ownership was picked up by huge European thinkers like Montesquieu, who used it to develop this idea of Oriental despotism, this notion that all Asian rulers are tyrants. It even popped up in the theories of Karl Marx. Bernier's book created a powerful, persistent, and often very negative image of India that lasted for generations. Which really brings us to the heart of it all. The storyteller's perspective is everything. These travelers, just by writing down what they found unusual or remarkable, were doing more than just documenting what they saw. They were actively creating the history that future generations would come to know. And that leaves us with something to think about, right? In our own time, with Instagram, with TikTok, with everyone sharing their travel stories and pictures all the time, what kinds of histories are we creating? How will the people of the future look back and understand our world based on the stories we're telling right now?